Good morning, good afternoon. I have no idea what time it is when you guys are listening to this, but welcome to part 2 of our tissues lecture. Let's just go ahead and get right in. So the last main tissue type that we're going to talk about is transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium is not very common throughout the body. It's only in a couple of places here and there. It has characteristics similar to that of stratified cuboidal and stratified squamous epithelium. Its cells are usually pretty dome-shaped, and they're usually found mainly in the bladder. And they allow for that stretching and relaxation of the bladder. Okay? So its main function is to promote distension of the urinary organs when they're full. So like I said, if you decide that you just don't want to go pee for like 12 hours, your bladder will be full, so those cells need to be able to stretch. And its main locations are the urinary bladder, the ureters, and the proximal urethra. And these two are just tubes. And that's an even longer tube. Yeah, they're tubes. We'll talk about their length more when we get to the urinary system. Okay? This is just an image of that epithelial tissue. So that transitional epithelial tissue. So these are that kind of dome-like tops to them. And they do look kind of stratified. You can see that there's many of them kind of all throughout here. So they do kind of have some of that stratified look to them, but they have that stratified columnar when stretched, and squamous when flat. Okay? Great. So let's move on to glands. Glands are essentially just a structure that is specialized for secretion. There are really two main types, endocrine and exocrine glands. Based on those we can assume that endocrine secretes kind of directly in, and exocrine will secrete directly out. Okay, so endocrine glands are ductless, they have no ducts, and they secrete directly into the surrounding tissue. So if I had a bunch of, say this is my gland here, and I have some blood vessels coming in through here, these glands are dumping their contents directly into that blood tissue or directly into the surrounding tissue. Okay? The main type of endocrine gland that we will talk about are, well, there's a lot of different endocrine glands, but they essentially make up your endocrine system. So we will be going into those in a lot more detail around chapter 17, but their main messenger molecules are called hormones. We've all heard of hormones. Some examples of hormones are estrogen, those are the common ones, testosterone, follicular stimulating hormone, etc., things of that nature. All right? Exocrine glands, on the other hand, have ducts. So they have ducts. They carry their products directly out onto the surface of the body or wherever they're supposed to go. So they go directly to that epithelial surface. And there are a lot more different types of exocrine glands than there are endocrine glands, okay? And we're going to talk about them in a little bit more depth kind of in the next few slides. But some of those glands do function such as secreting mucus, your sweat glands, the oil glands, the ones that like make you break out, your salivary glands, and your liver and your pancreas have some really important exocrine glands that we'll kind of talk about. So, exocrine glands can be kind of broken up into different parts. They're, well, different, I guess, labeling factions. They can be unicellular and multicellular. Endocrine glands can also be uni or multi. But one of the best examples of a unicellular exocrine gland is the goblet cell. Okay, goblet cells are named almost entirely for their shape. They look like little wine glasses. That's my best idea of a wine glass. Kind of thick on the top and kind of thinner down at the bottom. These goblet cells produce a protein called mucin. And when they release that mucin out into the cell surface and it mixes with water, it becomes mucus. Okay? Goblet cells' main function is to protect and lubricate a lot of the body's surfaces. And they're one of our most important unicellular exocrine glands. And this is an even better image of what I was kind of talking about there. So these secretory vesicles that have a bunch of mucin in them, they will release that mucin onto the surface, the epithelial surface, and mix with water to become mucus. Okay? Great. So, multicellular exocrine glands have two main basic parts to them, the epithelial walled duct and the secretory units. So you'll have the duct itself, we'll call this the duct, and then the secreting units themselves. Oh, that was supposed to be black, sorry. And our multicellular exocrine glands are broken into three main groups. The oh no. Let's try that again. The merocrine glands, the holocrine glands, and the apocrine glands. And all three of these glands are essentially named after how they secrete their secreting unit out onto the how they secrete their substance out into wherever it's supposed to be going. Okay? This is just kind of discussing how those multicellular glands are classified. They can be done so in a couple of ways. They can be simple or compound, and we'll see this more on the next slide. So simple being Probably just one layer of duct. Simple is simple. Compound has many. And its secretory unit can be all of these different types: tubular, alveolar, or tubulo-alveolar. Okay? We don't do much in terms of describing them like these. They're not often described like this. But they are a way that some scientists, some anatomists will describe the multicellular exocrine glands. Okay, so this is kind of the visual of that, in which the simple has just one little tube that does its work. This one also has just, technically, it's all just one connecting tube. So it's not exactly, it is branched, but they're not exactly disconnected. Whereas with this one, the compound, each of these branches are kind of individually on their, not so much on their own, they do function together, but you can see that there's 3 branches here as opposed to just this one branched structure. Okay? So that's the simple tubular. This is compound tubular. Alveolar, these are just a little bit thicker. Okay? So you have that simple, that one branch, whereas that compound has lots of those branches. That's 1, that's 2, that's 3. And then that tubulo-alveolar has a combination of the tubular structures and the alveolar structures. I do want to go back real quick and talk about the hang on guys, sorry, gotta pause. Okay, sorry about that. So I thought there was going to be a slide explaining that merocrine, holocrine, apocrine, but there wasn't, so I'm going to talk about them right here on this slide. Merocrine glands only use exocytosis to get its secretory contents out. And it does so by secreting directly into the ducts. Okay? An example of those are your salivary glands. Does not want me to write salivary. The holocrine glands will send a whole cell into the duct, and then that whole cell will rupture and send all of its contents out. Okay. And then the last one, apocrine glands. Only the apical, or the topmost part, gets shed off and has that the apocrine gland, only the top part gets shed off, and it contains the secreting unit, so the thing that needs to come out is only really on the top. So there will need to be a little bit of rebuilding on those ones, but not nearly as much as the holocrine glands. Okay, so that's for the slide prior. It wouldn't let me go back to talk about them, so I just wrote them out real quick right here. An example of a holocrine gland. I'll get back to you on that one. But an example of an infracrine gland would be like a mammary gland. Okay, great. So going back to where we are now at the lateral cell features and their junctions, those epithelial cells have to bind together to do their work. Okay, so there are a couple of ways that they do so. They can use adhesion proteins that link the plasma membranes of cells that are next door to each other. You could contour the cell membranes of cells next to each other, so you can just kind of make it cut in the part that we need. And there's also special cell junctions, and we'll talk more about those in the next few slides. One of those include tight junctions. Tight junctions can essentially close off an entire intercellular space. They kind of look like webs. If this is my cell wall, and this is the cell wall of another one, we have these junctions that kind of keep them together. Okay? They're found mainly at the apical region of most of the epithelial tissues. And they can prevent certain molecules from passing between cells of epithelial tissues. So if this one cell had a little bad guy in it that wanted to infect all of my other cells, the tight junction wouldn't let that happen. They'd say, no, we don't want you. You're a bad guy. You're not going to go hang out with my other brother cell, which has good stuff in it. Okay? So that's kind of tight junctions in a nutshell. You see, kind of like that. So they kind of link together, they web together, they interlock from one side to the other, and they form a continuous seal around that cell. Okay. Next, adhesive belt junctions. These kind of anchor directly onto one cell and then use these transmembrane linker proteins to connect to its neighboring cell. All right, they'll attach to those actin microfilaments that we talked about in the cytoskeleton to allow for the binding to the adjacent cell. Okay, so these transmembrane linker proteins, transmembrane linker proteins, plus the tight junctions that we talked about just before, form the tight junctional complex around apical lateral borders of the epithelial tissue. Do a little bit of thinking about what all of these words mean to identify where that might be in the cell. I'll even give you a little hint. This is my basal membrane. So think about where these would form. Okay? Next on our list, desmosomes. Desmosomes are the main junction for putting cells together. They're kind of all over the place throughout cells that are next to each other. The cytoplasm side of each plasma membrane has a little plaque, and then those plaques are joined by those linker proteins that we had talked about just in the slide before. linker transmembrane. Okay. So what they're, like I said, one of the main junctions in binding cells together, and they're kind of all over the place. They have an intermediate filament that goes all the way across one cytoplasm to another cytoplasm. And they're pretty common in cardiac muscle and epithelial tissue. And like this kind of image says, they do bind adjacent cells together, kind of like Velcro. Those are those linker proteins that I was talking about. This is one cell side to the other cell side. All right, and then gap junctions. Gap junctions are a little passageway in between two cells that are next to each other. Gap junctions are essentially a little hole, basically a little tube that can allow small molecules, specifically small molecules, to enter one cell and travel to the other. They're not this far apart. That's just kind of how I drew it. Okay? They function a lot in cellular communication. So you have your molecules and go along to this tube and talk to cell 1, or cell 2, sorry. Just kidding. I drew what I drew, but you get the gist of it, right? Cell 1, or whichever, will send molecules to cell 2 via this gap junction. And like I said, they have a little tube, lets that stuff run right on through. These are particularly important in heart cells and embryonic cells. Embryonic cells because they need to do what we call induction. We talked about that a little bit. And heart cells because they need to communicate so that they can work as a group. We've already talked a lot about the basal lamina. It is the boundary between the epithelium and the connective tissue. They are non-cellular in nature and mainly consist of lots of proteins secreted by the epithelial cells. There's that basement membrane that I was kind of talking about. What type of cells are these, based on how I drew them? So the basal lamina acts as kind of a filter because all of that tissue that is above the basal lamina is not very vascularized. So it acts as kind of a filter to determine which molecules from the capillaries, which is your vascular piece that is kind of underneath your epithelium, will end up going to the epithelium. Okay? It acts as a scaffolding, which helps to regenerate that epithelial tissue. And the combination of the basal lamina and its reticular layers form the basement membrane. And we talk about the basement membrane a lot when we're looking at those tissues from lab. Okay? We've talked about apical surfaces. We have the apical surface versus the basement membrane. We talked about that a lot. I'm not going to draw it. It's fine. And this slide is just talking about some special features that the apical surface may have. For example, you may have some microvilli. Microvilli are these finger-like projections. They're kind of like cilia, but they're a little different. They're projections of the plasma membrane, and they have a core. So they're not exactly as flimsy as our cilia tend to be. Okay? They're abundant in the kidney tubules and the small intestine, and they maximize surface areas from which small molecules enter or leave. You'd want that maximization of surface area in places like your intestine, because your intestine does a whole bunch of absorption of nutrients. Okay? So it's one of the special surface features of the epithelium. I like how I draw it, and then there's an image of it on the very next slide, but you guys know what I mean there. See those finger-like projections? They do have a core to them, so they're not as flimsy. But they do kind of look like our cilia that we will talk about right now. The cilia are whip-like, so those are real flimsy. Cilia. They have a core. They also have a core, but its core is a little bit less stringent. They move through the motor protein called dynin. Dynin is the specific protein that allows them to kind of, you can't see my hands, but allows them to kind of waft back and forth. And cilia function really to move things across the apical surface of a membrane. See that kind of whip-like propulsion. They kind of bend down. They kind of bend down. And it's very bend and snap kind of energy. You know what I'm saying there? Have we seen, it's not Mean Girls. Is it Mean Girls? Somebody let me know on Wednesday. Okay? Cool. So cilia. Okay. So that wraps up our discussion about about epithelial tissue. Let's switch gears and start talking about connective tissue. So connective tissue is very diverse. There are all different kinds and types of connective tissue, and their diversity ranges in their function as well as their structure and all kinds of different stuff. Connective tissue's main job is to support mainly the epithelia of the body, but also other pieces. All connective tissues are derived from, no, that's not how you spell derived, sorry, derived from embryonic mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is just a cell type that is found in the early embryonic tissue. And we'll talk a little bit about the structure of it and kind of all that it entails. But the main classes of connective tissue are connective tissue proper, and that gets broken down into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, cartilage, bone, and blood. Some of the important functions are to form the basis of the skeleton, store and carry nutrients, surround blood vessels and nerves, and they are kind of the main fighters of infection, and we'll get into how connective tissue plays a role in fighting infection, and that's mostly blood's job. Okay. Oop. Sorry, hang on, not letting me move on to the next slide. So some important things to note about connective tissue. It has more of an extracellular matrix, I'll probably refer to that as the ECM, than it does cells. So there's more of a matrix than there are cells. And that matrix is composed of ground substance and different types of fibers. Those fibers are mainly made of collagen and elastin. Those are the two main proteins that make up the fibers that will become like your dense and loose connective tissue. Okay? So the ground substance is made from the cells of that specific tissue type, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in our lecture. And like I said, its embryonic origin is the mesenchyme. Okay. So as far as the structural elements of this connective tissue, the main differences will be in the types of cells, and the other main differences will be the composition of the extracellular matrix. And remember, the extracellular matrix is made up of fibers. Does not want me to write fibers, Lord. And ground substance. But all connective tissues share mainly the same structural elements to them. And those structural elements include, first off, they include cells. Different type of connective tissues will have different types of cells. One of the main types are fibroblasts. We also have fibrocytes. All of these, you'll see that all of these end in blast. Blast is one of those root words that we're going to need to know. Blast, you can remember by thinking that it builds. So the fibroblasts, let's get rid of that fibroblast. Fibroblasts help make up some of that extracellular matrix. They build that extracellular matrix and other components, right? In the connective loose and dense connective tissue. Chondroblasts help build up some of that chondrocyte stuff that then gets secreted into the matrix of the chondrocytes extracellular matrix. Osteoblasts secrete their components into the extracellular matrix of the bone. So blast means to build. So the structural components that all connective tissue have are 1, cells, 2, we'll get there, okay? The only exception are to the ones that like build things are the cells that are in your blood. They don't produce their own matrix substance. They have other things that help do that for them. Because your blood is a liquid anyway. So they don't need as much of the secreting to build matrix as the other pieces of connective tissue do. And then we'll kind of talk a little bit more about areolar connective tissue, loose, like dense connective tissue, dense regular, dense irregular. We'll get into all of those in just a bit, okay? So cells are in all components of cells are a component of all connective tissue, as well as some other cell types that we note here, but we'll get to those. They all have fibers, okay? The extracellular matrix, like I said, is composed of those protein fibers and that ground substance. That ground substance is secreted by the, like, whatever blast cell. So in some cases, that's fibroblast, that's chondroblast, that's etc. And those fibers do their job by supporting. And each of the different types of fibers have different properties, right? So these fibers come together and form different types of connective tissue. So the collagen fibers, they're the strongest. Sorry, give me 1 second. They're made mostly entirely of collagen, which is a protein. They're mainly straight and unbranched in their structure. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're inflexible, okay? So when you pull on a collagen fiber, if I pulled this in one direction, I pulled this in another direction, you would see that kind of tensile strength. That strength only really goes in one direction. So if I'm pulling, if you like grab a piece of rope and you pull on it, you pull on both ends of the rope, you're seeing that kind of tensile strength, okay? Reticular fibers are made of collagen as well, but instead of being that straight kind of rope-like texture, reticular fibers are more net-like. They're like a net, like a fishing net. Like if I'm trying to, if I catch a fish and I put it in the net, my net is still going to hold, but it's able to resist many different directions of stretching and moving and pulling. So this one's more multi-directional. Okay, I remember this by thinking about a rope. Think about this one like a net. And elastic fibers do not contain any collagen. They have their own special protein called elastin. Elastin does exactly what you think it does. It helps things recoil after stretching. They are very, very stretchy, and they come in kind of wavy bands like that. Kind of like that. If you ever had some pants that got too tight after you ate some food and you needed to stretch them out a little bit, like sweatpants have like an elastic band on the side so that you can stretch them, but they can still go back to how they used to be if they need to. Okay? So those are the main types of fibers that we will talk about. You can remember this elastic fibers by thinking about like a bungee cord. Okay? So, ground substance. Ground substance is produced by the primary cell type of the tissue. So if the tissue's main cell type are fibroblasts, the fibroblasts are what are making that ground substance. Okay? It's usually pretty jelly-like. And the viscosity of the connective tissue is dependent on the thickness of that ground substance and the fibers that you find in that ground substance. Ground and fibers. That makes sense. Okay. So it usually has a lot of proteoglycans. Proteoglycans are just like glycogen-like proteins, or proteins that have glycogen groups or something like that. Glycosaminoglycans are also another special type of protein. Ground substance cushions and protects your body structure. It holds excess fluid, except for in the blood. Blood is the exception. Blood has its own blood is a liquid, so it doesn't really need to make a liquid for it to be functional. All right? But so the main 3 structural components of the connective tissue are the cells, the fibers, and the ground substance. You can kind of think of the ground substance as the dirt beneath your feet. I think my computer has decided to stop with the PowerPoint. I'm sorry if you're hearing all of this loafing that I'm kind of doing in the middle, because technology has stopped working for me. Okay. But that's your main guys. All right? This table is just kind of showing classes of connective tissue, and we're going to get into these a little bit in like a couple of slides, so don't worry too much about that. I would use these to come back to after we've gone through a few of them, like in this lecture. Okay. Like we said, the embryonic connective tissue is made from the mesenchyme. It has that jelly-like ground substance, and all of its cells are mesenchymal cells. Nothing too deep about that. Okay? So, connective tissue can be broken into different groups. So let's break that down. We have connective tissue proper, and we have specialized connective tissue. That's not how you spell specialize. Connective tissue proper gets broken down further, maybe, if it wants to let me draw, into loose and dense, and the specialized get broken into cartilage, bone, and blood and lymph. Okay, so that's kind of the breakdown. Right now, we are focusing on connective tissue proper. Okay, so first part of connective tissue proper, loose connective tissue. There are 3 different types: areolar, adipose, and reticular. Dense connective tissue, there's dense irregular, dense regular, and elastic tissue. This is embryonic connective tissue. This is kind of just a little micrograph to kind of show you what it is that we're looking at. You can see these like pinkish parts up in here. These are the fibers. This open kind of space that you see in through here, that's the ground substance. And these deeper purple are the cells. Okay, so Areolar tissue is kind of used as a model for all other connective tissues. Okay? So connective tissue proper, and we'll talk about all of those in a minute, but connective tissue proper is also called fibrous connective tissue. Because it is rich in fibers, has many generalized functions. It's also called generalized connective tissue. So it's rich in fibers. They have generalized functions. And they're found pretty much everywhere in the body.
You missed some letters.
Sorry, my housemate is telling me that I missed some letters. Say hi, Sunny. Sunny
Hi,
doesn't
Sunny.
want. Okay, bye-bye.
You still missed it.
It's not letting me do it. It's fine. You guys get the gist of it, right? Found everywhere. There. Okay, maybe. Okay. So, this image here shows us kind of what, and if you guys remember from the labs, the histology lab slides, the areolar tissue kind of just looked like a bunch of mix-match spaghetti with some other like stuff in it. And that's okay, right? So that tissue is loosely held together. Like if you held it up to the light, if you could like pick up your connective tissue and hold it up to the light, you'd kind of be able to see through it. And that's what that loose connectiveness allows for. Okay? So the areolar tissue, widely, well, we'll talk about that. This is kind of just an image, like I was saying, it has all of these fibers, all different kinds of fibers and types of fibers. Areolar tissue has all of the fibers. It has some adipose cells, it has some mast cells here and there, and has some macrophages here and there, etc. Okay. Actually into areolar connective tissue. So it is widely distributed throughout the body. It's also known as the universal packing material. Because it's kind of just everywhere throughout your body. It underlines all of the epithelial, pretty much all of the epithelial tissue. And you have epithelial tissue everywhere, as we learned in our last section about epithelial tissue. All three fiber types are found. So you still, in your areolar connective tissue, you're going to see some collagen fibers. You'll see some reticular fibers. It does not want me to write reticular, Lord. And some elastic fibers. Okay? You'll also see a whole bunch of different cell types in there. You'll see fibroblasts and fibrocytes. You'll see mast cells. Mast cells release histamine, so they help you with like allergic reactions and things of that sort, of essentially getting your body to be like, hey, something's wrong. That's mast cells' jobs. Macrophages get rid of things like usually toxic things. You can think of those as big old trash cans. And adipocytes. Adipocytes, as we know, adipocytes are fat cells. Okay? So your areolar connective tissue does surround small nerves and blood vessels. A lot of its functions are shared by other connective tissues, and it pretty much borders every other tissue in the body, right? The major functions of areolar connective tissue are to support and bind with other tissues. Because we remember that connective tissue's main function is support. And as far as binding, it's pretty much just acting as the glue between your basement membrane and the layers below. Okay? Since your connective tissue is so loose, it does allow for some liquid to be stored in there. So some extra body fluid definitely gets held in your areolar connective tissue. Because of those macrophages, we can do quite a bit of defense against infection. And we do a lot of storing of nutrients as fats. But we'll talk about that more when we talk about the adipose tissue. Okay? Like I said, all three fiber types are present in our areolar connective tissue. Our rope-like collagen fibers, our net-like reticular fibers, and our very elastic fibers. These are made of elastin, and these two are made of collagen. And fibroblasts produce all of these fibers, as well as the ground substance. Okay. This is, again, just kind of going through what I've been saying. The areolar connective tissue has a gel-like matrix with all three fiber types, which are, I'm not going to tell you, remember them. They have all types of cells within them. They've got fibroblasts, macrophages, mast cells, some white blood cells. Those also help in maintaining or trying to fight off infection, sorry. And its main function is to wrap and cushion your organs, hold some extra fluids, and they play a really important role in inflammation, and that's those mast cells. You will find areolar connective tissue pretty much everywhere. Okay? So that's kind of what I was saying over here with the loose areolar connective tissue. If you could pick it up and hold it up against some light, you'd be able to see right through it. Because all of these fibers are held together very, very loosely in that extracellular matrix. Okay, so here you have that ground substance, this open space, ground substance, but you also have those fibers. You can see the elastic fibers are kind of wavy, kind of mishmash here and there. And the collagen fibers look a little thicker. They look a little bit more put together. Okay? And then dark purple are, again, our nuclei of those cells that secrete all of those things that make the tissue what it is. Okay? So the tissue fluid itself, also known as the interstitial fluid, is pretty watery. Like I said, there's a lot of empty space. And that tissue fluid is derived from the blood. Okay? The ground substance is viscous, it's kind of spongy. It's made mostly of sugar, proteins, etc. And all of that stuff is just dissolved contents. So if our body had to keep everything in tip-top form all the time without dissolving them and then remineralizing them when they needed them, our blood would be way too chunky and it probably wouldn't flow. Okay? But like we said, that ground substance is secreted and made by those fibroblasts. Okay? Your areolar connective tissue is mainly where your body fights infections. So like if you get a cut Your skin is your first layer of defense, but beyond that, once that barrier is penetrated, your body needs another way to fight the infection. And your areolar connective tissue is the main place that's going to happen. Okay? Because you have things like macrophages, plasma cells, those are mainly in the blood and things like that. You have your white blood cells, you have your mast cells. All of these play an important role in fighting infection. Ah! Okay? So that wraps it up for this PowerPoint. Go ahead and move on to part 3 when you are ready.